Enterprise, part 2 of our Deathday party. We left the 3 of our leading characters in a party hosted by Nearly Headless Nick for his death day, and we've just met Moni Myrtle, and she ran out of the room crying, with Peeves following her, pelting her with peanuts. "Oh dear," said Hermione sadly. Nearly Headless Nick now drifted towards them through the crowd. "Enjoying yourselves?" "Oh yeah," they lied. "Not a bad turnout," said Nearly Headless Nick proudly. "The Wailing Widow came all the way up from Kent. It's nearly time for my speech. I'd better go and warm up the orchestra." The orchestra, however, stopped playing at that very moment. They and everyone else in the dungeon fell silent, looking around in excitement as a haunting horn sounded. "Oh, there we go," said Nearly Headless Nick bitterly. Through the dungeon's walls burst a dozen ghost horses, each ridden by a headless horseman. The assembly clapped wildly. Harry started to clap too, but stopped quickly at the sight of Nick's face. The horses galloped into the middle of the dance floor and halted, rearing and plunging. A large ghost at the front, whose bearded head was under his arm, blowed the horn, leapt down, lifted his head high into the air so that everybody could see him over the crowd. Everyone laughed, and strode over to Nearly Headless Nick, squashing his head back onto his neck. "Nick," he roared, "how are you? Head still hanging in there?" He gave a hearty gawp and clapped Nearly Headless Nick around the shoulders. "Welcome, Patrick," said Nick stiffly. "Livens," said Sir Patrick, spotting Harry, Ron and Hermione, and giving a huge fake jump of astonishment so that the head fell off again. The crowd howled with laughter. "Very amusing," said Nearly Headless Nick darkly. "Don't mind, Nick," shouted Patrick's head from the floor. "Still upset we won't let you join the hunt? But I mean to say, look at the fellow." "I think," said Harry hurriedly, at the meaningful look on from Nick, "Nick's very frightening, and "Ha!" yelled Sir Patrick's head. "Betty's asked you to say that." "If I could have everyone's attention, it's time for my speech," said Nearly Headless Nick loudly, striding towards the podium and climbing into an icy blue spotlight. "My late layman lords, ladies and gentlemen, it is with my great sorrow," but nobody heard much more. Sir Patrick and the rest of the Headless Hunt had started a game of head hockey, and the crowds were turning to watch. Nearly Headless Nick tried vainly to recapture his audience, but gave up as Sir Patrick's head went sailing past him to large cheers. Harry was very cold by now, not to mention hungry. "I can't stand this much more," Ron muttered, his teeth chattering as the orchestra ground back into action and the ghosts swept back along the dance floor. "Let's go," Harry agreed. They all backed towards the door, nodding and beaming at anyone who would look up at them. A minute later they hurried back up the passageway full of black candles. "Pudding might not be finished yet," said Ron hopefully, leading the way towards the steps in the entrance hall. And then Harry heard it. "Rip, tear, kill." It was the same voice, the same cold, murderous voice he'd heard in Lockhart's office. He stumbled to a halt, clutching the stone wall, listening with all his might, looking around, squinting up and down the dimly lit passageway. "Harry, what are you?" "It's that voice again." "Shut up a minute." "So hungry for so long." "Listen," said Harry urgently, and Ron and Hermione froze, watching him. "Kill. Time to kill." The voice was growing fainter. Harry was sure it was moving upwards. A mixture of fear and excitement gripped him as he stared at the dark ceiling. How could it be moving upwards? Was it a phantom to whom stone ceilings didn't matter? "This way," he shouted, and he began running up the stairs into the entrance hall. It was no good hoping to hear anything there in the great hall. Harry sprinted up the marble staircase to the first floor. Ron and Hermione clattered behind him. "Harry, what are we—" "Shh!" Harry strained his ears distantly from the floor above, and growing fainter still, he heard the voice. "I smell blood. I smell blood." His stomach lurched. "It's going to kill someone," he shouted, and ignored Ron and Hermione's bewildered faces. He ran up the next flight of steps, 3 at a time, trying to listen over his own pounding footsteps. Harry hurtled around the whole of the second floor, Ron and Hermione panting behind him, not stopping until they turned a corner at last, in a deserted passage. "Harry, what was all that about?" said Ron, wiping sweat off his face. "I couldn't hear anything." But Hermione suddenly gave a gasp, pointing down the corridor. "Look!" Something was shining on the wall ahead. They approached, slowly squinting through the darkness. Foot-high words had been dubbed on the wall between 2 windows, shimmering in the light cast by a flaming torch. Read: "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware." "What's that thing hanging underneath it?" said Ron, a slight quiver in his voice. As they edged nearer, Harry almost slipped over. There was a large puddle of water on the floor. Ron and Hermione grabbed him and they inched towards the message, eyes fixed on the dark shadow beneath it. All 3 of them realised what it was at once, and they leapt backwards with a splash. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, was hanging by her tail from the torch bracket. She was stiff as a board, her eyes wide and staring. For a few seconds they didn't move. Then Ron said, "Let's get out of here." "Shouldn't we try and help?" Harry began awkwardly. "Trust me," said Ron. "We don't want to be found here." But it was too late. A rumble, as though a distant thunder, told them that the feast had just ended. From either end of the corridor they came stood to the sound of hundreds of feet climbing the stairs, and a loud and happy talk of well-fed people. Next moment, students were crashing into the passage from both ends. The chatter and the bustle, the noise died suddenly as people in front spotted the hanging cat. Harry, Ron and Hermione stood alone in the middle of the corridor, and silence fell among the mass of students, pressing forward to see the grisly sight. Then someone shouted through the quiet, "Enemies of the air, beware! You'll be next, mudbloods!" It was Draco Malfoy. He had pushed to the front of the crowd, his cold eyes alive, his usually bloodless face flushed, and he grinned at the sight of the hanging, immobile cat. Okay, Enterprise. We will read some more next time to find out who has done this to Mrs. Norris. See you later.